The first time Mara wrote it down, she did it on a napkin. It was a small thing. A sentence in a shaky hand. The ink smudged where her thumb had pressed too hard. I am not the woman who cleans the toilet for my son. She folded the napkin and tucked it into the pocket of the cardigan she kept for errands. She told herself she would throw it away that night. She did not. Her son, Jonah, had grinned when he said it. The grin had been a flash of teeth and triumph, the kind of grin that belonged to boys who had learned how to wield small cruelties like keys. He had been 27 then, with a job that paid better than his father's had ever paid and a confidence that made him careless. He had said, "I'm the boss now, you clean the toilet." As if the words were a joke, as if the house and the people in it were props in a play he had been given the right to direct. Mara had laughed, because what else do you do when your child humiliates you in front of friends? She had laughed and then gone to the bathroom and scrubbed the toilet until her knuckles ached. She had scrubbed until the porcelain shone like a lie. That night she took the napkin out of her cardigan and smoothed it on the kitchen table. She read the sentence again. The words looked different in the lamplight, as if they had been waiting for her to notice them. She put the napkin into a shoebox she kept under the sink. A shoebox full of receipts, old keys, and the kind of small, domestic evidence that accumulates in a life. She told herself she would forget it. She did not. The shoebox became a ledger. She began to write. At first it was small. The date, the phrase Jonah had used, the context. Then she added the names of the people who had been there, the color of the shirt Jonah had worn, the way his voice had risen. She wrote down the way her husband, David, had looked away. She wrote down the way the friends had laughed. She wrote down the way the house had felt. The air thick with the smell of lemon cleaner and the metallic tang of humiliation. The ledger grew. It was not a ledger of money. It was a ledger of slights. She wrote the slights in columns. She gave each one a number. She began to see patterns. The numbers added up. Mara had been a teacher for 25 years. She had taught children to read, to parse sentences, to find the subject and the verb. She had been patient with other people's mistakes. She had not been patient with her own. When Jonah moved back into the house after a failed marriage and a job that had evaporated, Mara had welcomed him. She had cooked his favorite meals and left notes on the fridge. She had folded his shirts and put them in the drawer he had used as a teenager. She had told herself that this was what mothers did. They made room. Jonah's return came with a new swagger. He had a girlfriend, then another, then a string of short-lived romances that he announced like trophies. He had a job at a startup that required him to be on all the time. He worked late, came home with coffee stains on his collar, and spoke in the clipped language of people who measure success in metrics. He called his mother Ma, in a tone that suggested he was performing affection. The first months were tolerable. Jonah paid rent sometimes. He fixed the leaky gutter. He took the trash out when he remembered. He also moved things. He took Mara's favorite mug and used it for his coffee. He left his shoes in the hallway. He left his friends on the couch. He left his voice in the house like a new piece of furniture. Mara began to notice the small things. The way Jonah would rearrange the photos on the mantel, angling them so his face was more visible. The way he would answer the phone and say, "I'm busy," as if the house itself were an interruption. The way he would stand in the doorway and tell her what to do, as if the house were his office and she were an assistant. She wrote it all down. The ledger became a ritual. Each night she would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and the shoebox and write. She wrote the date, the offense, the context, and a column she labeled response. At first the responses were small. A note left on the fridge, a passive-aggressive comment, a withheld dessert. Then the responses became more deliberate. She began to test Jonah. She would leave a dish in the sink and watch to see if he would wash it. She would put his keys in a bowl and move them to the top shelf. She would call him by his full name in front of his friends. She would say, "Jonah, please don't speak to me like that," and watch the way his grin faltered. He did not change. He escalated. One evening, after a dinner where Jonah had mocked her cooking and his friends had laughed, he stood and announced, "I'm the boss now, you clean the toilet." The words were casual, the grin wide. The friends laughed. David, Mara's husband, looked down at his plate and said nothing. Mara felt something inside her shift. It was not anger, not at first. It was a cold, precise awareness. She felt the ledger in her head, the columns aligning. She felt the numbers adding up. That night she did not scrub the toilet. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote. She wrote the sentence on a new page and underlined it twice. She wrote the names of the friends who had been there. She wrote the date. She wrote the way Jonah's grin had looked like a promise. She began to plan. Mara's plans were not dramatic. They were small, like the ledger. She began to test Jonah's boundaries in ways that were almost invisible. She started with his coffee. Jonah drank his coffee black and strong. Mara began to switch his brand with a cheaper one. She ground it coarser. She left the jar on the counter with the label turned away. Jonah complained. He said the coffee tasted off. He blamed the barista at the shop. He did not suspect his mother. She moved his shoes. She put them in the closet and replaced them with a pair that pinched. Jonah cursed and stomped around the house. He accused David of hiding his things. He accused the cat. He did not accuse Mara. She left notes. She wrote, "You are not the boss of this house." She left them in places Jonah would find them. On the bathroom mirror, inside his laptop case, under his pillow. He laughed at first. Then he grew irritated. He began to lock his door. Mara recorded everything. The ledger grew thicker. She began to add a new column. Escalation potential. She rated each offense on a scale of 1 to 10. Jonah's grin that day, the one about the toilet, scored a 7. She began to think in terms of leverage. If Jonah wanted to be the boss, she would show him what being boss meant. Her first deliberate act of sabotage was small and precise. Jonah had a presentation at work and had been rehearsing in the living room. He left his laptop on the coffee table and went to the kitchen for a drink. Mara took a pen and wrote a single line on a sticky note. "You are not the boss." She stuck it to the corner of his laptop screen. When Jonah returned, he laughed and peeled the note away. He did not notice the tiny smear of ink she had left on the keyboard. He did not notice the way the smear had gotten into the keys. The presentation went poorly. Jonah blamed the software. He blamed the projector. He blamed the coffee. He did not blame his mother. Mara watched him from the doorway. She felt a small, private satisfaction. The ledger recorded it. Presentation sabotaged. Jonah blames external factors. Escalation potential 4. She was careful. She never did anything that could be traced back to her. She left no fingerprints on the coffee jar. She used gloves when she moved his shoes. She learned to be invisible. But invisibility has a cost. The more she acted, the more she had to act. Each small victory required another small act. The ledger demanded balance. For every humiliation Jonah inflicted, Mara found a way to return it. The house changed. It became a field of traps and counters. The photographs on the mantel were rearranged so Jonah's face was less prominent. The thermostat was adjusted when he was out. The mail was redirected. Jonah's friends began to complain that things were missing. Jonah accused the cat. He accused the neighbors. He did not accuse his mother. David noticed. He asked Mara if she was all right. She said she was fine. She smiled and made tea. She wrote in the ledger. The ledger was not enough. Mara wanted proof. She wanted to know the shape of Jonah's life outside the house. She wanted to know who he was when he was not performing for friends. She wanted to know what he hid. She began to investigate. Mara had been a teacher. She knew how to ask questions without seeming to ask. She called Jonah's exes under the pretense of checking on old classmates. She asked about his temper, his habits, his friends. She listened. She took notes. She learned that Jonah had a pattern. He left jobs when he felt slighted. He left relationships when he felt bored. He collected people like trophies and discarded them when they no longer served him. She learned about a man named Eric, a former business partner who had disappeared from Jonah's life after a fight. She learned about a woman named Lila who had been humiliated at a party and had left town. She learned about a ledger, a physical ledger that Eric had kept, a small book where he recorded debts and favors. The ledger had been missing since Eric's disappearance. Mara's curiosity became an obsession. She wanted to find Eric's ledger. She wanted to know if Jonah's grin had been practiced on other people. She wanted to know if the pattern of small cruelties extended beyond the house. She began to follow Jonah. She sat in her car outside the coffee shop where he met clients. She watched him from the library window as he argued with a man in a suit. She trailed him once, keeping a distance, until he ducked into an alley and kissed a woman she did not recognize. She wrote it down. The more she learned, the more the ledger filled. She began to see Jonah as a node in a network of small violences. He was not unique. He was part of a pattern. The ledger recorded names, dates, and places. It recorded the way Jonah's grin had been used to displace responsibility. One night, while Jonah was out, Mara found a receipt in the trash. It was for a storage unit on the edge of town. The receipt had Jonah's name on it. Mara's heart thudded. She wrote the storage unit number in the ledger and circled it. She did not go to the storage unit that night. She waited. She planned. The storage unit was a small, windowless place behind a strip mall. The lock was a cheap padlock. Mara had never broken a lock in her life. She had never needed to, but she had learned to be careful, and she had learned to be patient. She watched the unit for 3 days. She noted the times people came and went. She learned the rhythm of the place. On the 4th day, she went at dusk with a flashlight and a pair of gloves. She had a key she had bought from a locksmith, a universal key that fit many cheap locks. She told herself she was doing it for evidence. Inside the unit she found boxes. She found a small wooden crate with Eric's name carved into the lid. She found a ledger. The ledger was not like Mara's. It was neat with columns and numbers and names. It recorded favors and debts, favors repaid and favors withheld. It recorded the way people had been manipulated. Jonah's name appeared several times. Next to his name were small notations: loaned money, borrowed charm, withheld help. There were other names Mara recognized: Lila, Eric, a woman named Simone who had been fired from a job after Jonah had whispered something to her boss. Mara took a photograph of the ledger with her phone. She felt a thrill that was almost religious. She had proof. She had a map. She left the storage unit and drove home in the dark. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote. The ledger in the shoebox grew heavier with the new information. She added a new column: external corroboration. She pasted the photograph of Eric's ledger into the shoebox with a paperclip. That night Jonah came home late. He smelled of cologne and cigarettes. He laughed about something on his phone. He did not notice the photograph on the kitchen table. He did not notice the way Mara's hands trembled when she poured him tea. Mara did not confront him. She did not need to. She had the ledger. The ledger changed everything. It gave Mara leverage she had never imagined. She could expose Jonah. She could show David the pattern. She could make the house safe again. She decided to test the ledger. She printed a copy of Eric's ledger and left it on the coffee table where Jonah would see it. She watched him pick it up and flip through the pages. His face did not change. He set it down and went to the bathroom. When he returned, he said, "Where did you get that?" Mara said, "I found it." Jonah's grin was small. "Found it where?" "Wherever things are found," Mara said. He laughed. "You're being dramatic, Ma." Mara said nothing. She had learned that silence could be a weapon. That night Jonah did not sleep. He paced the living room and checked his phone. He called someone and spoke in a low voice. Mara could hear the cadence of his anger. She wrote it down. The next morning Jonah was different. He was careful. He avoided the ledger on the coffee table. He avoided Mara's eyes. He left the house early and did not return until late. He began to clean the toilet. Mara watched him. She felt a small, private victory. The ledger had worked. But the ledger had also made Jonah dangerous. One evening, Jonah came home with a man Mara had never seen. The man was tall and broad-shouldered, with a face like a bruise. He introduced himself as Marcus and said he worked with Jonah. He sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and asked questions about the house. He asked about David's work schedule. He asked about the neighbors. Mara felt a coldness in her chest. She wrote Marcus's name in the ledger and underlined it. That night Jonah did not sleep. He argued with Marcus on the phone. He spoke in clipped sentences. He said, "We can't have her poking around." He said, "She's unstable." He said, "We'll handle it." Mara did not know what handle it meant. She only knew that the ledger had made Jonah act like a man who had something to hide. The first twist came when Mara found a note under her pillow. It was a single line, written in a hand she did not recognize. "Stop looking, or you will regret it." Mara's hands shook. She wrote the note in the ledger and circled it. She felt the ledger's weight like a physical thing. She called David at work and told him about the note. David said, "Maybe it's a prank." He said, "Maybe Jonah is trying to scare you." He said, "Don't make a mountain out of a molehill." Mara did not believe him. She had learned to trust the ledger more than she trusted anyone. She began to take precautions. She changed the locks. She installed a camera in the hallway. She put a small recorder in Jonah's room. She learned how to hide things in plain sight. The recorder captured a conversation one night. Jonah and Marcus were in the living room, speaking in low voices. Jonah said, "She found the ledger." Marcus said, "Then we make it look like she's losing it." Jonah said, "No, we make it look like she did it." Mara listened to the recording with her heart pounding. She wrote the conversation in the ledger and underlined it twice. She had proof now. She had a recording of Jonah conspiring to discredit her. She had Eric's ledger. She had the note under her pillow. She had the photograph of the storage unit. She had the shoebox full of evidence. She thought of going to the police. She thought of showing David. She thought of confronting Jonah in front of his friends. She thought of burning the house down and starting over. Instead she planned. Mara's plan was not to expose Jonah publicly. She wanted to make him feel the ledger the way she had felt it, as a slow, accumulating pressure that would eventually break him. She began to manipulate the ledger itself. She took Eric's ledger and added entries. She wrote Jonah's name next to new offenses. She invented favors and debts that had never existed. She wrote that Jonah had promised to pay Eric back and had not. She wrote that Jonah had been involved in a scheme to defraud a client. She wrote that Jonah had been seen with a woman who had disappeared. She did not forge handwriting. She added notes in the margins, in a hand that looked like Eric's but was not. She planted the ledger where Jonah would find it. She left a copy in his car. She sent an anonymous email to his boss with a photograph of the ledger and a note. "Check your employees' references." The consequences were immediate. Jonah's boss called him into a meeting. Jonah's clients began to cancel. Jonah's friends distanced themselves. Jonah's confidence cracked. Mara watched him from the kitchen window as he walked down the street, shoulders hunched. She felt a small, private triumph. The ledger had become a weapon, but the ledger had also become a mirror. One night, as Mara sat at the kitchen table, she realized that the entries she had added were not just lies. They were possibilities. They were ways of imagining Jonah as someone who could do worse things than he had. She had written him into a narrative of malice. She had given him a history he might not have had. She felt a sudden, dizzying doubt. Had she created the monster she feared? Had her ledger, in its attempt to balance the scales, become the thing that tipped them? The second twist came when David found the ledger. He had been away on a business trip. He returned to find the house quiet and Jonah gone. He found Mara at the kitchen table, the shoebox open, the ledger spread like a map. He picked up the photograph of Eric's ledger and frowned. "Mara," he said, "what is this?" Mara told him everything. She told him about Jonah's grin, about the note under her pillow, about the recording. She told him about the storage unit and the ledger and the anonymous email. She told him about the entries she had added. David listened. He did not shout. He did not cry. He sat down and put his hand over Mara's. "You should have told me sooner," he said. "I didn't want to make it worse," Mara said. David's face hardened. "We go to the police," he said. Mara hesitated. The ledger had been her private work. It had been the way she had kept score. She had not wanted to drag the house into the light. She had not wanted to be the woman who made a scene. But David was right. The recording, the photograph, the note, these were things the police could use. They could get a restraining order. They could make Jonah leave. They went to the police. The officer who took their statement was polite and efficient. He listened to the recording and looked at the photograph. He asked questions about the note. He asked about the storage unit. He asked if Jonah had a history of violence. Mara told him about the ledger. She told him about the entries she had added. She felt a flush of shame. The officer's face did not change. "You added entries?" he asked. Mara nodded. "That complicates things," he said. "It makes it harder to prove anything." Mara felt the ledger's weight like a physical thing. She had thought the ledger would be proof. She had not thought that her own hand would be the thing that undermined it. The police took the recording and the photograph. They said they would look into the storage unit. They said they would speak to Jonah. They said they would keep an eye on the house. Jonah did not return that night. He called once, his voice tight. He said, "You went to the police?" He said, "You betrayed me." He said, "You'll regret this." Mara hung up and wrote the call in the ledger. The third twist came 2 days later when the police called back. They had found Eric's body in a shallow grave behind an abandoned warehouse. He had been dead for weeks. The ledger in the storage unit had been photographed by the police and catalogued as evidence. Jonah's name appeared in the ledger. Jonah was a person of interest. Mara felt the world tilt. She had wanted to expose Jonah's cruelty. She had not wanted anyone to die. She sat at the kitchen table and wrote Eric's death in the ledger. She underlined it. The house became a place of whispers. Neighbors came by with casseroles and questions. Jonah's face was on the news for a day, then another. The police came and went. Marcus was arrested for questioning and released. Jonah's friends refused to speak to him. Jonah's boss fired him. The house became a place of whispers. Neighbors came by with casseroles and questions. Jonah's face was on the news for a day, then another. The police came and went. Marcus was arrested for questioning and released. Jonah's friends refused to speak to him. Jonah's boss fired him. Jonah called Mara and screamed. He accused her of setting him up. He accused her of being jealous. He accused her of being a liar. He said, "You made me look like a murderer." Mara listened. She felt a coldness in her chest. She wrote his words in the ledger and circled them. The police called Jonah in for questioning. He was pale and thin. He denied everything. He said he had been at a bar the night Eric disappeared. He said he had no reason to kill Eric. He said he had been set up. Mara watched the news and felt a strange detachment. She had wanted justice. She had wanted Jonah to feel the ledger. She had not wanted a body. The fourth twist came when the police found a photograph in Eric's ledger. A photograph of Jonah and Marcus and a man Mara did not recognize. The man's face was blurred, but his posture was familiar. He was standing behind Jonah, his hand on Jonah's shoulder. The photograph had been taken at a party Mara had attended years ago. She remembered the man now. David's old friend, Paul, who had moved away after a scandal. Paul had been at the party. Paul had been drunk. Paul had been angry. Mara's stomach dropped. She wrote Paul's name in the ledger and underlined it. She called David at work and asked him about Paul. David said, "We haven't spoken in years." He said, "Why are you bringing him up?" Mara said nothing about the photograph. She did not want to make things worse. She only wanted to know. She began to look at David differently. She began to notice the way he avoided certain topics. She began to notice the way he would leave the room when Jonah's name came up. She began to notice the way he would check his phone and smile at messages he did not show her. The house felt like a stage where everyone had a role. Mara had been the mother. Jonah had been the son. David had been the husband. But the roles were porous. People moved in and out of them. Mara's investigation widened. She looked into Paul's past. She found a string of small scandals. A business that had collapsed, a woman who had left town, a rumor of a fight. She found a photograph of Paul with Eric at a bar, laughing. She found a receipt for a motel room with Paul's name on it, dated the night Eric disappeared. She took the information to the police. They listened. They said they would follow up. That night David came home late. He smelled of cologne and something else, the metallic tang of fear. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at Mara. "We need to talk," he said. Mara felt the ledger's weight like a stone. She had been waiting for this talk. She had been waiting for the moment when the house would reveal its secrets. David said, "There are things I haven't told you." Mara's heart thudded. She wrote the words down in the ledger. David told her about Paul. He told her about a business deal that had gone wrong. He told her about a night when he had been at a bar and had argued with Eric. He told her about a man who had threatened him. He told her about a ledger he had seen once, years ago, that Eric had kept. He told her about a debt that had been called in. Mara listened. She felt the world tilt again. The ledger in her shoebox felt like a map with new roads. David said, "I didn't tell you because I thought it would blow over. I thought we could handle it." Mara looked at him. She saw the lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled. She saw the man who had been her partner for 30 years and wondered how well she had known him. The fifth twist came when Mara found a photograph in David's wallet. It was a photograph of David and Paul and Jonah, taken at a picnic years ago. Someone had scratched out a face in the photograph, a face that had once been smiling. The scratch was deliberate, the paper torn. Mara felt a coldness in her chest. She wrote the photograph in the ledger and underlined it. The house had become a pressure cooker. The police were asking questions. Jonah was a person of interest. Eric was dead. Marcus had been arrested and released. Paul was back in town, claiming he had nothing to do with Eric's death. David was hiding things. Mara felt the ledger's columns like a countdown. She wanted answers. She wanted to know who had killed Eric and why. She wanted to know whether Jonah had been involved. She wanted to know whether she had been the architect of a tragedy. She decided to confront Jonah. She waited until he came home from a meeting and then asked him to sit in the living room. She had the recorder in her pocket. She had the ledger on the coffee table. She had the photograph of Eric's ledger and the note from under her pillow. Jonah sat and looked at her with a mixture of anger and fear. He said, "What do you want, Ma?" Mara said, "I want the truth." He laughed. "You want the truth? You're the one who planted the ledger." Mara felt a hot flush of shame. She had planted entries. She had manipulated evidence. She had not meant for Eric to die. She had not meant for Jonah to be accused. But she had done it. Jonah's face hardened. "You think you can play detective and not get your hands dirty?" he said. "You think you can make me look like a monster and not expect consequences?" Mara said, "I wanted you to stop." Jonah's laugh was a bark. "You wanted me to stop? You wanted me to stop by making me lose everything? You wanted me to be humiliated? You wanted me to be the joke?" Mara said nothing. She had no defense. She had only the ledger and the recorder and the memory of the napkin. Jonah stood up. He walked to the mantel and picked up a photograph. It was a photograph of him as a child with Mara and David. He held it like a weapon. "You think you're the only one who keeps ledgers?" he said. "You think you're the only one who remembers?" Mara felt a chill. Jonah's voice had a new edge. He was not the boy who had grinned and made jokes. He was a man who had been cornered. He said, "You don't know what I've done. You don't know what I've had to do to survive. You don't know what people expect." Mara said, "Then tell me." Jonah's face crumpled. He sat down and put his head in his hands. For a moment he looked like the boy who had once been small and frightened. He said, "I didn't kill Eric." Mara felt a rush of relief and then a new wave of doubt. She had wanted Jonah to be guilty. She had wanted him to feel the ledger. She had not wanted him to be innocent. Jonah told her a story. He told her about a deal that had gone wrong, about money that had been promised and not delivered. He told her about Eric's temper and Paul's threats. He told her about a night when he had been at a bar and had argued with Eric and then left. He told her about a man who had followed him home and threatened him. Mara listened. She recorded his words. She wrote them in the ledger. The confrontation ended with no resolution. Jonah left the house that night and did not return for 2 days. He called once and said he needed space. He said he would be back. Mara sat at the kitchen table and wrote. The ledger had become a palimpsest of stories, each layer obscuring the one beneath. She felt the house closing in. The police called again. They had a new lead. A witness had come forward. A woman who had been at the bar the night Eric disappeared. She said she had seen Paul arguing with Eric and then leaving with a man who matched Marcus's description. She said she had seen Jonah leave earlier. She said she had seen a car with a dented bumper drive away. The police arrested Paul. Paul denied everything. He said he had been at home. He said he had an alibi. He said he had nothing to do with Eric's death. The trial began in a small courtroom that smelled of old wood and coffee. Mara sat in the back and watched Jonah sit at the defense table, his hands folded. David sat beside her, his face pale. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had been manipulated by Jonah and Marcus. They showed Eric's ledger and the photograph of Jonah and Marcus. They played the recording of Jonah and Marcus discussing how to discredit Mara. They argued that Jonah had been part of a scheme that had led to Eric's death. The defense argued that the ledger had been tampered with. They argued that Mara had planted entries. They argued that the police had not followed proper procedure. They argued that there was reasonable doubt. Mara watched the trial like a spectator at a play. She felt the ledger's weight like a stone. She had wanted justice. She had wanted Jonah to be held accountable. She had not wanted a man to die. The reveal came on the 3rd day of testimony. A witness took the stand, a woman who worked at the storage facility. She said she had seen Jonah and Paul arguing in the parking lot the week before Eric disappeared. She said she had seen Marcus get into a car with Paul. She said she had seen Paul's car leave with a dented bumper. The prosecution rested. The defense called no witnesses. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned with a verdict. Guilty. Paul was sentenced to 10 years. Mara felt a hollow victory. The ledger had worked in a way. A man had been convicted. Jonah's name had been cleared in the eyes of the law. But the ledger had also been a weapon that had been used to shape a narrative. Jonah came home after the trial. He was quiet. He did not speak to Mara for days. He moved out of the house and into a small apartment. He called once and said, "I need to be alone." Mara sat at the kitchen table and wrote. The ledger had become a map of losses. Months passed. The house settled into a new rhythm. David went back to work. Jonah called occasionally. The neighbors stopped bringing casseroles. The shoebox under the sink remained, full of receipts and photographs and the ledger. Mara tried to return to her life. She taught a class. She graded papers. She made tea. She wrote in the ledger. One evening, as she was cleaning the attic, she found a box she had not seen in years. It was a box of photographs from before Jonah was born. She opened it and found a photograph of a family picnic. In the photograph, a man stood behind Jonah with his hand on Jonah's shoulder. The man's face was scratched out. Mara's hands trembled. She had seen that photograph before in David's wallet. She had written it in the ledger. She had underlined it. She took the photograph downstairs and put it on the mantel. She sat and looked at it. The scratched-out face seemed to stare at her. That night David came home and sat beside her. He looked at the photograph and then at Mara. "There are things I haven't told you," he said. Mara felt the ledger's weight like a stone. She had been waiting for this moment. She had been waiting for the house to reveal its secrets. David told her the truth. He told her about a night years ago when he had been drunk and had gotten into a fight with Paul. He told her about a ledger he had seen Eric keep, a ledger that recorded favors and debts. He told her about a man who had threatened him. He told her about a night when he had been at a bar and had argued with Eric. He told her about a man who had followed him home and threatened him. Mara listened. She felt the world tilt again. The ledger in her shoebox felt like a map with new roads. David said, "I didn't tell you because I thought it would blow over. I thought we could handle it." Mara looked at him. She saw the lines around his eyes, the way his hands trembled. She saw the man who had been her partner for 30 years and wondered how well she had known him. Then David said something that made Mara's blood run cold. "There are things I did to protect you," he said. "There are things I did to protect Jonah." Mara felt the ledger's columns like a countdown. She had wanted answers. She had wanted to know who had killed Eric and why. She had wanted to know whether Jonah had been involved. She had wanted to know whether she had been the architect of a tragedy. David's voice was steady. "I made a call the night Eric disappeared," he said. "I told someone to make sure Eric left town. I thought it would scare him. I thought it would be enough." Mara's mouth went dry. "Who did you call?" she asked. David looked at her with a tired, terrible honesty. "Paul," he said. Mara felt the world tilt. She had not expected this. She had not expected the man she had loved to be the architect of the ledger's most dangerous turn. David said, "I didn't mean for him to die. I only wanted Eric to leave. I wanted him to stop threatening us." Mara felt the ledger's weight like a stone. She had wanted to expose Jonah's cruelty. She had not wanted to find that the house itself had been a theater of secrets. The final twist came when Mara realized the full shape of the ledger. It was not just a record of Jonah's cruelties. It was a map of the family's compromises. It was a ledger of favors and debts that had been kept and called in. It was a ledger that had been used to protect and to harm. Mara sat at the kitchen table and wrote. She wrote David's confession in the ledger and underlined it. She wrote Eric's name and the date of his death. She wrote Jonah's grin and the napkin. She closed the shoebox and put it back under the sink. Years later, the house still stood. The mantel still held photographs. The shoebox still sat under the sink. The ledger had been sealed in an evidence bag and returned to Mara after the trial. She kept it in a drawer. Sometimes she would take it out and read it. She would trace the lines of her handwriting and feel the memory of the nights she had spent at the kitchen table. She would think of Jonah and David and Eric and Paul and Marcus and the way their lives had intersected. One afternoon, as the light slanted through the curtains, Mara climbed the attic stairs and found the box of photographs again. She took out the picnic photograph and looked at the scratched face. She ran her finger along the scratch and felt the paper's roughness. She thought of the ledger and the way it had been used. She thought of the napkin and the way a single sentence had grown into a map. She thought of the way small cruelties could accumulate into something that could break a life. She took a pen and, with a steady hand, scratched out a face in a new photograph. A photograph of Jonah as a man, standing in front of the house. She scratched the face carefully, deliberately, until the paper tore. She put the photograph back in the box and closed the lid. As she descended the attic stairs, she felt a strange peace. The ledger was a record, not a verdict. The house had been a stage, and everyone had played their part. Some had been cruel. Some had been protective. Some had been both. Mara turned the key in the front door and stepped into the kitchen. The light was warm. The tea kettle sang. She set the shoebox on the table and opened it. She took out the napkin and smoothed it on the table. She wrote one last line in the ledger, "We are all capable of ledger-making." She folded the napkin and put it back in the shoebox. She closed the lid and slid the box under the sink. Outside, a child laughed. Inside, the house was quiet. On the mantel, the photographs looked back, faces intact except for one. A face that had been carefully scratched away. Mara turned off the light and went to bed. The ledger slept in the dark, a small, patient thing that kept its own counsel. Did the story send chills down your spine? And from which city are you tuning in tonight? Let's meet in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark tale, you can support me with a super thanks so I can keep uncovering more gripping true crime stories for you. Thank you so much for your support. It helps me bring even more suspenseful narratives to life. I'm looking forward to your thoughts on this mystery. There's a lot more waiting for you on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe, like, and share. See you in the next chilling story with intrigue and respect.